Hello, and welcome to the Zerto Master Disaster video covering storage considerations for continuous replication and recovery operations. My name is Justin Nordeste, and I'll be your host today. Today's agenda will cover several topics, including general recovery storage considerations, recovery storage I/O usage, both during regular replication and during recovery operations. After this, we'll take a deep dive into the Scratch Journal concept and finally provide some additional resources for additional learning. In general, when starting to consider recovery storage, it's important to remember that Zerto can utilize any storage available to the hypervisor, regardless of the type or version. Basically, since Zerto works hand in hand with the underlying hypervisor, we can take advantage of any storage that the hypervisor can see, both to replicate VMs from and to replicate VMs to. Zerto continuously replicates I/O for the protected VMs, and this helps provide the lowest RPO possible. So as VMs make changes to their disks, Zerto will see this and replicate it. It's important to remember that Zerto will only replicate unique, non-duplicate writes created between the checkpoints for the protected VMs. Zerto is 100% completely software-based. We do build the VRA appliances to scale with the hypervisor. And this really means that we're going to be able to take advantage of the infrastructure that's provided to your virtualization environment. So as you scale your infrastructure up and as you increase the performance of it, Zerto is going to be able to keep in step with these performance increases. As a general best practice, Zerto recommends using comparable storage at the recovery site. And as we go through the information on the next couple of slides, you should be able to see why. So during ongoing replication, as protected VMs make writes, these will be copied, compressed, and replicated by the production side virtual replication appliance. When they're received from the DR side VRA, the data will be decompressed and then written to the journal. At this stage, for every write taken by the protected VM, there's generally going to be one write within the CDP journal at the recovery site. This process is going to continue as we continue to protect the virtual machine. Once the CDP history has been met as specified on the protection group settings, the VRA will then begin to read the oldest data that's within the oldest checkpoints. This data will be read from the journal and then applied to the recovery volumes. The idea here is that we want to remove the old data from the journal since it's no longer in scope in terms of the specified CDP history, and this will allow us to create new space and more space on the CDP journal for the newer I/O that's going to come in. So as you can see here, there's definitely a stream of I/O. As it's replicated over, it'll first enter into the journal. Once it's expired from the specified CDP history, it'll then be read and applied to the recovery volume for that virtual machine. Now during operations, things are a bit different here. So for Zerto, we create the recovery VM when the operation's created. And basically this VM could possibly have data in three locations. The first is the recovery volume that's attached to the virtual machine for the operation. The other two possible disks are going to be the CDP journal, so depending on the checkpoint that's chosen for the operation, there could be data that's within that journal. And we also have the Scratch journal, which we're going to cover in a little bit more detail in just the next slide here. So as the recovery volume makes requests, Zerto is going to transparently, in the background, take care of where this data has to be read from. So the Scratch journal is primarily used for writes, and we'll cover that again in more details in just a second. But if the recovery VM has to read data from the recovery volume or from the CDP journal, Zerto is going to help broker that process. This way we're making sure that the recovery VM is getting the appropriate data. So our Scratch journal is created automatically. It's created for all of the operations within Zerto in terms of live failover, move and a failover test. And it has a lot of similar characteristics to our CDP journal. It's thin provisioned. It's on the same storage as the CDP journal. And it also inherits the same warning and maximum size thresholds as the CDP journal. And as I mentioned before, the Scratch journal really gives us a place to write for the failover test VMs, as well as in any of our before commit operations. The idea here is that we don't want to dirty the data set. So for those live operations, live failover and the move during the before commit phase, those VMs will write to the Scratch journal. This way, if we do want to roll back the operation, we can simply remove the Scratch journal, and we know that the CDP journal and the recovery data hasn't been dirtied, as part of that process. Obviously, if we do want to commit that operation, what will happen is that the recovery VRA will essentially take the data that's within the CDP journal and the Scratch journal and promote it to the recovery VM. Now, this whole process is orchestrated by Zerto and controlled by Zerto, so users don't have to take any action for this. It's also completely transparent both to the virtual machine and the guest. So as your VMs are recovered, they're fully accessible during that before commit phase, and as we're promoting the data during the promotion phase. For failover test VMs, the Scratch journal again gives us that great area to write to for those VMs so that we don't dirty any of the data. This is especially important for failover test because we are going to continue replicating during the failover test. So obviously when you stop the test, we want to remove the data that was part of the test since it's no longer needed, since the test is completed. But since we are replicating in the background, it is important to note that those testing recovery VMs are going to produce their own load on the storage. They are going to be, reading, again, potentially from the CDP journal, also the recovery volumes, and they could also be reading and writing to the Scratch journal. If you're looking for additional resources for some of these topics, details can be found on the Zerto support homepage located at zerto.com/support. From there, on the documentation, on the downloads page under the documentation downloads section, the two relevant PDFs are going to be the ZVM Administrator's Guide and the Journal Overview Best Practices Guide. Thanks for watching, and for any questions, please feel free to reach out to your contact at Zerto.